Hello friends, my name is Marinez, and today I have a review of A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. This is the first book in a series that centers around a magic school, and in this magic school there are no teachers, there are no lessons and books in a traditional sense, and many of the students who attend the school are going to die. In this world there are a bunch of creatures that feed off magic and people who have magic, and so it's very dangerous, especially for young magicians, and so they almost have a better chance of surviving by all being at the school at the same time, even though it's still very dangerous. Because of the nature of the school and because there are dangers around every corner, the students here have to bond together and form alliances. They have to do basically everything together, but it's also a very give and take sort of relationship that forms. So it's all about what everybody can do for each other in a certain regard. And so we follow our main character, Elle, who is kind of isolated and closed off from her fellow students. She's got some relationships, but not many. And also her innate magic is a dark magic that she does everything she can to sort of fight against and not tap into, because even though it make her incredibly powerful to use this innate magic, it also runs the risk of killing everybody at the school. And so she's constantly battling against this. Before I get into my review of this book, I will kind of take you on my journey with this book. And it is that when I heard about it, I was immediately interested because Naomi Novik is an author that intrigues me. I've read Uprooted, which I really enjoyed, even though it's a love-hate thing in BookTube. And I read the first in her Temeraire series, which I enjoyed. I think I gave it 3 stars, but I never continued on with the series. That's not really to say anything about the series. I just suck at continuing on in series. And I am currently reading Spinning Silver. I say that with kind of a shrug because I've been currently reading it for a while. Again, not to say anything about the book, it's just been a weird reading year. So anyway, Naomi Novik is somebody who, when she puts something out new, my ears perk up. So I was very interested in this, especially because it's a magic school, and I mean, I love a good magic school story. I was sent this copy by the publisher, and around the time that I received it, I saw the first review that was kind of talking about the representation in here in a negative way. I think that there are 2 main ones that I've seen and that got kind of cycled around the community in terms of some missteps that Novik took in regards to portraying her main character and also various other supporting characters that have different backgrounds. So I went into it first I was excited, and then I was oh no, kind of hesitant, or at least I went into it with that in mind, that I should kind of keep an eye out for that thing. I had already received a copy and we picked it for our House Salts book club and our live show, so I was going to read it anyway. I just had in my mind that I should keep an eye out for this. I can kind of boil this down to sort of 3 main complaints that I saw. One is in a passage where Novik is explaining why people tend to keep their hair short in this world, and why actually the shorter your hair is and the more you can maintain it that way, how that is a display of wealth, because it is the smartest thing to do to not give sort of these creatures any hold on you. So she's talking kind of generally about that concept, but she mentions locks in specific in the way that locks attract bugs, basically magic feeding bugs or whatnot. And in context, you can kind of see that she was talking about hair in general and keeping hair short, but she didn't mention any other specific style or hairstyle besides locks. So it's you should keep your hair short. And also, if you wear locks, you're gonna get bugs in your hair. And it was kind of ooh, you didn't think that through. And I think more than anything, it was thoughtless. And I think that it's one of those things where I always say okay, that thing doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it exists within a larger context of how locks are viewed and portrayed, and sort of other stereotypes about that hairstyle being kind of dirty or unclean or whatnot. So whether or not it was done maliciously is kind of beside the point, because it was done carelessly enough that you've created this thing now where if somebody reads it, they're going to be what are you trying to say? So that is the one thing that Novik apologized for and said that she was taking out of her book for future printing, so she's addressed that piece of it. The other complaints were, one I saw was about the use of mana in here. This is an area where I can't speak so much about, so I will leave the critique that I saw about this, specifically because it is something that is not exclusive to Novik. She's not the first person to sort of use this idea of mana in a fantasy, but also that doesn't excuse her from using it. So if you want to read more about that concept and, how it sometimes is appropriated in fantasy, I will leave a link below. And then the third thing that I saw was about the other supporting characters. So this is like a multicultural school, I guess. There are a lot of characters from different backgrounds, and the sort of magic that Elle does to not like tap into her darker innate magic is language magic. So she studies a lot of different languages, which opens up to her a lot of different spells. The treatment of some of these characters was called into questions in terms of stereotypes and the way that they were portrayed. I think that it's one of those things that your mileage may vary. I will say that I don't think it was done particularly well with any of them, but I think that it feeds into a bigger issue that I had with this book, and it was that it is sort of like undeveloped in its characters overall. And I think that while the world feels intricate in the amount of details that we receive about it, there is a level of like being superficial there. So I think that both those things combined make it so these characters come across sort of one-dimensionally. Whether or not you will find any of this like as sort of a deal breaker in this book, I think again is up to you personally as a reader and sort of your sensitivities and whether or not your identities are the one being represented in this book. I personally, they were all cringe moments for me, and I had other issues with the book, so they were things that I was kind of like, but at the same time, there were things that I still definitely enjoyed in this book. So these things that were cringe moments for me that weren't done particularly well weren't deal breakers for me personally. So take that with a grain of salt because, there is no one reviewer that can talk to all of the identities represented here or all of the moments. And even if they could, their take on this, I think, is going to be different than somebody else's take on this. So, listen to as many reviews as you can, read up on it, and then you kind of decide if any of these things are things that are triggers for you or that would be upsetting for you, and then make the best decision for you. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. I think that the main thing that dragged it down for me was that this was incredibly exposition heavy. And it was my least favorite kind of exposition when it comes to world building. I tend to favor world building where the author kind of just drops you in the middle and you can figure it out for yourself, where in this, the author is very much explaining things to us in so many words. And when we do have that sort of like exposition where you're explaining things in so many words, I prefer that the author try and disguise it. Like I would rather have like a plot appropriate school lesson where the teacher's like, today we're going to talk about demons, and you're like, ooh, learning with the character or whatnot, rather than what we get, which is the main character just narrating the stuff at us and being like, here's how it works in the world, la 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 la, and going on and on and on. And so I had a problem with that method of like info dumping. And then I also had a problem because as much as I ultimately enjoyed the world, I felt like it was over explained. I think that all of the elements of it are really cool, but none of the elements of it are particularly complex. So there was no reason to go into as much detail as Novik did, especially in this first book. I think with a high level overview of the world, we would have done just fine with what this book was kind of giving us and expecting of us to understand. But she delves in deep, and you can tell that she's thought of all of these elements of her own world, but that they weren't necessary to us as the reader or to this first entry in the story. I listened to this on audiobook while I was following along, and a lot of times I was just zoning out, and then I would come back and like pick up the story just fine because it was just this running stream of like info dumpiness. If you've ever gotten the sense of a narrator who talks too much, it's so hilarious to me when I have this experience because you're reading, right? And so the whole thing is words. But have you ever read a book where you're like, you're talking too much? That's the experience that I got here, especially at the beginning of the book. Number one complaint by far, it was just too heavy on that exposition and the world building, and it didn't do enough, I think, with the plot or the characters. That said, I really enjoyed the main character, Elle. She is persnickety, so she's a character that I can kind of see some people falling on the opposite side of because she is kind of just like grumpy in a way that I thought was really funny and brought some like levity to the book as well. And the way that she's got like this sort of innate dark magic is really interesting, and especially because the school keeps like prodding her in that direction. situations. Like she'll ask for a simple spell and the school will like provide her with like a spell that will like wipe out a population. And so she's like, ah, damn it. And so those moments of humor I thought were really well done and needed in this book. This is kind of like a darker story in theory. So it's got a lot of dark elements. The school is obviously like really violent. Kids are dying at the school or whatnot. But interestingly, I didn't think it leaned in enough to that darker side. Like there were times where someone died and it just is glossed over in this way that felt weird to me. I wish we had spent more time like really understanding the darkness of this world in a way that I felt that we didn't. And had we leaned into that darkness, but then it had these moments of levity and humor, that would have been a really wonderful balance. Instead, I don't know, I got this sense of like, knowing in my head that this was a dark book, but not really feeling it because of the way that we just sort of like gloss over these things. I like too Elle's dynamic with all of the different characters, especially with Orion, who is like the main male character. He's something of a himbo, except for not beefy, like he's not there yet. But he's like a himbo in the making, which I really enjoyed. And I really enjoyed his innate magic and how that pairs up against Elle's innate magic. I think that they had a really interesting dynamic. It was like definitely Grumpy and Sunshine-esque to me, which is something that I enjoy. And it wasn't so hate to love that it was unenjoyable. It was actually like the perfect amount of like them bickering and then being like, wait, are we flirting? Are we together? And like I said, her relationship with the other characters was great as well, especially because she's learning about like how to form alliances and whatnot, and sort of building this little found family around herself from within the school, which is something that's always going to be really interesting to me. The opposite part of that is that I honestly could not name another character in this book besides Elle and Orion. They all, as soon as I finished reading it, like kind of slipped out of my head. And it wasn't that they weren't interesting in what we got to see, but it just was kind of like they were a little bit flat or one-dimensional, especially because we spent so little time with them. So I enjoyed what they were bringing to the story while I was reading about them and while they were on page, but it just wasn't very much there. And so it was kind of easy to forget as you move on. Some of the things about the side characters that were like complaints about them being sort of like only their identity or the language that they speak, I didn't feel that. I think in a lot of ways, all of the characters sort of like identify with their innate magic, and there is a lot to be said about like how people are grouping up, and that does sometimes come down to where they are from because there are different like alliances and stuff, but all of that in context felt explainable to me. It didn't feel like problematic to me at all. Again, your mileage may vary. I'm not like the end all be all on this matter. It worked fine for me. Again, my main complaint was that it was a little superficial and not all the way developed, and that was kind of across the board. There were like really interesting tidbits in here as well. I really love when a book can kind of look at the darker side of some of the tropes. So I mentioned the Fairyland series all the time and how that is like colorful and bubbly and lush and rich, but still looks at like sort of the darker side of fairy tales in terms of what our character goes through and her like acknowledging the price of being in a portal world and what she has to, do in order to have these adventures. So this being like the darker side of a magic school and it just being like, I don't know, you're gonna come here to die. Like I loved all of that and the details of that. I also thought that the commentary, at least on wealth and class, was done well. The commentary on like racism and other stuff like that, not done well. And I don't want her to try and do anything with it going forward. But the idea of like wealth and the privilege that provides as you see the different like alliances and stuff, that was really interesting to me, especially as you see Elle breaking that down and sort of making her own rules. I thought that was neat. The plot was really interesting to me because you start in like her third year at the school and she's already got a good basis of knowledge about her own magic. So magic schools typically start like year one and you kind of learn with the person. And here it started year 3, which made sense to me in terms of where we started the story and what story Novik wanted to tell. But it also didn't help like her info dumping, I don't think. I think was probably one of the causes of it, is that, you know, our main character knows all of this stuff already because she's been in this world already, but we're just coming in now. And so she kind of feels like she has to sit there and explain things to us. So that was interesting. And then just like the progression of the story. So we're told that, you know, a certain thing happens to all seniors at the end of their term, but that thing happens to our character already, but she's got one more year of school. So it left me really interested in where or what direction this story is going to go in, because I can't imagine being like totally in for just like another full year at the school with like nothing else to it. But that's like me projecting forward and thinking about what the second book is. This is really interesting, and I rated it 3 stars because that felt like an average of my feelings. My highs were high and my lows were low with this, and when I think about it, I think about it fondly in terms of like my experience, and then also just like the experience talking about it. There was a lot to like talk about here and sort of like comb through, which is always something that I enjoy, but thinking about like just suffering through like that beginning info dump and some of the ways that she just sort of dropped the ball on the characterization and some of the more superficial things that she gave us, you know, I can't overlook those things. So 3 stars it is. I would definitely continue on in this series, and I think this would be an easy series for me to continue on with, because even though like the details of like the characters and stuff might bleed out, I think I'm going to retain the main pieces of that, which are the main characters and sort of like the big thing that happened at the end that is going to set up the second book. If you have read or would like to read A Deadly Education, I would love to talk to you about it down in the comments. My next video is going to be a comment response, and I haven't done this in a while, so I have plenty of videos to go back and like pull comments from. But if you have anything specific that you would like to ask me, or you'd like to hear an update about, or would like me to address, feel free to leave those down in the comments as well. I'll look here first and then kind of go back to my other videos for my comment response. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. That's kind of all premise. I guess the plot is that she basically forms an alliance with a popular kid at school who's sort of a do-gooder, and they start to learn things about the school and kind of unlock secrets, I guess, is the plot. Ah, goodness.